Welcome to After Deadline, the media podcast. I'm Kathy Fowler.
I'm Mark Silverstein.
We are veteran TV reporters, recovering TV reporters who turned to the dark side and now work as PR and marketing gurus. And now we like to talk to
Let's get right to the guest.
Journalists.
I am so excited to talk to Sabrina Siddiqui. She took a little jaunt recently.
Yeah, so I heard about that.
Now she's the
only one of two people.
Very exclusive trip. She's also the White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal, which is a show in and of itself. But let's start by just saying hi to Sabrina and seeing if she's over the jet lag and the train lag of where she's been in recent months. Hello.
I guess I'm over the jet lag, but when you have an 11-month-old baby, you're never really sleeping consistent hours. So, I don't even know if I was ever jet lagged. I'm just like, my body is just conditioned to being awake at odd hours and going to sleep at odd hours. But I do feel like maybe about 5 weeks later, I've recovered from the trip, minus the teething that's going on with my baby at the moment.
So let's get to this trip. You've been someplace back in February. You were having a regular evening, right? And then what happened?
I was supposed to travel to Poland with President Biden on Monday, February 20th. And, I was going to be one of the reporters in the press pool. That's the group of journalists who follow the president wherever he goes when he leaves the White House. And that was going to be a pretty straightforward trip. We were going to go to Warsaw for 2 days. It was to mark the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then the Friday before, I'm already kind of a little anxious. I'm leaving my baby for the very first time. I hadn't even spent a single night away from her before.
And then going to Poland. You're like,
yeah, this is Poland.
Kind of far.
It's just like, it's far, right? I'm going to Europe. It's the first time away from her. I'm going to be in another continent. I'm pumping. There's all this stuff going on. I'm still breastfeeding. And then all of a sudden I get a call on Friday saying, can you come to the White House? And I'm like, is everything okay? And, this call is from the White House Correspondent Association president, Tamara Keith, who works for NPR. And she's like,
so you think you're getting called to the principal's office? Is that what
She just saying, come to the White House. I can't really talk about it on the phone. And we'll talk about when you get here. And I'm thinking, am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong?
Wait, let me look at my last 3 stories.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's coming from the president of the Correspondents Association. So she doesn't work for the White House. She just oversees the White House correspondents who cover, the White House on a day-to-day basis. So I did think something's going on with this trip, but I did not anticipate that when I got to the White House that Friday afternoon, it was just me, Tamara Keith, the president of the Correspondents Association, Kate Bedingfield, who at the time was the communications director at the White House. She has since left, but she was President Biden's communications director up until a month ago, and Evan Vucci, a photographer with the Associated Press. So now I'm thinking, why are there just 3 journalists in this room, but one of us is the president of the Correspondents Association. So clearly there's something very unusual happening, and that's when Kate Bedingfield, the communications director, says, well, the president's going to Kyiv. He's going to Ukraine and leaving tomorrow night, as in Saturday overnight. And it's just going to be, if you guys are up for it, it's just going to be the 2 of you, meaning you, Sabrina, and you, Evan Vucci of the Associated Press, because there's extraordinary security considerations with this trip. We can only accommodate 2 journalists in this pool. And, it's going to be a very involved, a highly sensitive trip. You guys are going to be sworn to secrecy, and we leave in, 36 hours. Are you guys up for it? No hard feelings if not.
No hard feelings if you're like, wait, could I die?
Yeah.
So it's kind of the opposite
Dangerous.
of Oprah saying, you get a car, you get a trip to Kyiv, and you get a trip to Kyiv.
Yeah.
And you're like, whoa, this is
wow.
So what was your first thought? I mean, was it an immediate yes, or were you like,
Did the world spin? Was it like a little
it would have
surreal?
been an immediate yes 5 years ago, but now I have a child. Like, what?
Right. I mean,
your head?
I actually ended up writing an essay about this for the Wall Street Journal, but my first thought and even first question was, well, how am I going to pump on this trip? Like, I'm like, I just got back from maternity leave. What is this going to look like for me as a new mom, as someone who's just come back from maternity leave and is still adjusting to that balance? And luckily, both Kate Bedingfield, the communications director, and Tamara Keith, the WHCA president, are working moms themselves, and they have young kids. So at least, you know, having two women in the room meant they got it. And they were like, we've already thought about that. We can walk through those logistics. So honestly, the initial conversation was actually about my pumping logistics, which was really unusual. It just shows you how much times have changed for the better. But
Yes.
also, of course, I was thinking, I mean, I was asking what it's actually going to entail in terms of how we get there. And, you know, also, are we going to need security gear, like protective gear? How much of a risk is there really associated with this trip? You know, you're traveling with the president of the United States, so it's the safest way to travel in many ways, but he's also going into a war zone where the US military does not have an active presence on the ground. So it's not the same as when previous presidents have gone to Iraq and Afghanistan, where they've flown directly into a military base, thanked the troops, and left. It's very different.
Yeah, and this was literally other than maybe Abe Lincoln, right? I mean, this was history making, where a president went to a war zone where they're not, you know, secured because there's military guarding them, right? I mean, was it Abe Lincoln was the only other president or something?
Yeah, I mean, there's just no precedent in modern history that anyone was able to think of. And you know, they said they're going to take our phones away. So that's another issue where, you know, that we're talking about logistics. It's like, you guys can only tell your spouse and one editor at your news organization. And this is because obviously you can't just disappear off the face of the planet and not have anyone know where you are. And really, it was actually in case something bad happens, they need to know who to reach. Um, you know, the phones were going to be taken from us until we essentially were departing Kyiv. No Bluetooth or Wi-Fi enabled devices would be allowed, just because of like they wanted to make sure there's no location sharing for the group that's traveling with the president, no, you know, risks whatsoever that would have been added to what is already a high stakes trip. And then they said that the journey would be, you know, unprecedented another way, because the plan was to leave Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, where the president typically flies out from, you know, in the middle of the night, Saturday night, early Sunday morning, and land in Poland. And then from Eastern Poland to take a 10-hour train to Kyiv. Because in addition to the US not being active on the ground in Ukraine, the US does actually not enter Ukrainian airspace, neither commercially nor militarily. So now they're telling us that there's also going to be a 10-hour train ride each way. So actually 20 hours on a train. And this is all happening, at least on the way. It's certainly going to be happening in secrecy. Their hope was maybe on the way back too. Their hope was that this would all stay under wraps until President Biden was back in Poland. That didn't happen. We can get to that later. But it was, you know, it was just very surreal at that meeting, because nothing like this had actually been done before. And then to be one of two journalists to bear witness to it, and to be tasked with covering it and dispatching these pool reports, which are these like summaries of what the president is doing that one journalist writes each day and shares with the broader media. It was a tremendous responsibility.
Yeah, I would be. I mean, first of all, it's an incredible honor. You know, I mean, the honor that they bestowed to pick you is just, it is a testament to your work. And then the fact that I mean, think of like
Or
5
was
years
it? I
ago.
mean, not that it to do anything less than the honor, but I mean, was it your turn up as the pool?
Well, I was actually going to say, so it's very kind and you know, that you sort of, that in some ways you could say a testament to my work, but I have to say there's a rotation, and I was sort of up next, and I was supposed to be the pool reporter for the flight out to Warsaw on that Monday, the 20th. So some of this happened by chance, where now we're going to Ukraine, we're going to Kyiv instead. And since it's my turn, in fairness, the trip was first offered to me. Having said that, what, you know, obviously we didn't, this situation didn't come to pass. The question, I think, would be, what would have happened if it would? There's a lot of news outlets in the rotation, and there, you know, the Wall Street Journal is a legacy paper. I've been covering national politics for more than a decade. I've been covering the White House from day one, but also have covered previous administrations. So we don't know what would have happened if it had been another news
Well,
outlet.
if you were not a great reporter, and then they could have had an easy out. I mean, because 5 years ago, would they have asked a woman? Think of like in the history of women in journalism, just to get to be able to write, right? Like if you look even, a couple decades ago, but then now to be like, to go ahead and say, listen, we've already thought about your whole, breast pumping, and not only pumping, but keeping and storing, which is a big deal. That's not easy for like 20 days or a couple days, not 20 days, 20 hours on a train.
Yeah.
And I mean, so, they wouldn't have done it if you weren't amazing. Or, you know
Thank
what I mean?
you.
They would have
I do.
figured out a way to skip over you, don't you think?
No, thank you. I do. I think, like, of course, the fact they were already thinking about it and that they were like, yeah, okay, Sabrina, we'll figure it out, was of course something that I'm very grateful for. And with in terms of access and the fact that there were only two journalists, that's something that, of course, there was a big debate around, both prior to and after. The only time in any recent history that there's only been two reporters in the pool, which is typically about 13 journalists. The only recent time that that's happened was on 9/11. And so, there's just not much precedent. There is a precedent for it, but not much. I mean, I think that, having said that, because of the extraordinary security circumstances and the logistics of the travel, there's just no way they would have been in a position to accommodate a dozen journalists. I mean, the president only brought 3 of his own staffers. Everyone else was, his physician and Secret Service and an added security presence.
Yeah, I hope a lot of
Well,
added security.
There's always a train involved when it's Joe Biden.
I
So
know, right? Well,
he's
that's also
Like, this is great. It's a train, 10
what
hours.
time do we get off in Wilmington? Is what is it?
well, that's also what is funny, because it just is that also reinforced in many ways how unsafe this was, because they don't let him take the train in the United States. He wanted you. Everyone knows. But if you don't know, that President Biden famously loves trains and Amtrak. I mean, he commuted via Amtrak when he was in the Senate and as vice president back to Wilmington. But in the Senate, he did it every day. And, he would go back as vice president every weekend, probably by train to Wilmington. When he was elected as, in the 2020 election, he wanted to take the train from Wilmington to DC for his inauguration. And they said, sir, we can't let you do that. And when they've been promoting this infrastructure bill and he's gone on this tour around the country, he's also wanted to take the train, and they're like, sorry, like that's just not something that they can do logistically in terms of security. So that, it's just like, of all the train rides to take, it's a 10-hour overnight train from Eastern Poland into Ukraine, and we crossed the border within an hour of getting on that train. So 9 out of 10 hours on the way, both ways that were in Ukraine itself. So it was truly extraordinary.
Yeah, and there's still, obviously, bombs are still falling, from in Kyiv too, right? I mean, like it's a very. So what did you say? Wait, I think about this.
How much time did they give you?
I'd like to talk to my husband, because that's the only person you could talk to is your husband
and the editor. Yeah.
And the editor. But did you want to did you internalize it first, or did you kind of make up your mind and just want to make sure that everybody else is?
Yeah, I'm doing this, honey.
Get on board.
You're with Sophia.
Well, I mean, in the meeting, I was like, I'm doing it. I didn't, it was like, let me think about it as pretty much like, well, no, I'm doing it.
Yeah.
I'm doing it.
I'll get my husband on board this train.
Yeah, let's follow up about the other logistics, that this will entail, but count me in. And then my husband, it's so funny. Well, what's really funny about it is, like, this is like sort of like some weird sitcom of sorts, where that day I happened to be co-hosting my colleague's baby shower in the office. And so I had to go back to the office and just act like everything's normal, and I'm receiving these balloons from Party City and decorating, and okay, let's make sure we've got everything, the banner, and I'm just my mind is running in a million directions, and everyone is coming up to me at this baby shower for my colleague, and just oh, are you ready for Poland? Are you all set to go to Warsaw on Monday? And are you excited? And I was like, yeah, Yeah.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
all set.
Scared to death.
And then my husband, meanwhile, is like, "Is everything okay? You've been really quiet today." And I was like, "I'll talk to you when I get home." And so,
Yeah, because you can't even talk to him on a phone, right? Like,
no, that's the
it
thing. I
has
was like,
to be person to person. And then you have to have, like, loud music in the background, and you go in the kitchen. See if
yeah.
the
I mean,
place is bugged.
my editor was like, I was like, "I have to talk to you." And they joked. They were like, my editor was like, "Oh, do we have to go to a skiff?" Like that's what they call those, those rooms or spaces where you go for like to review like classified documents or to have classified meetings. And I was like, well, I mean,
Kinda.
we do need to find a private room actually. Yeah. And like, just to kind of walk through what was going to happen and what the embargo would entail. Embargo, of course, just meaning that we can't say anything about this trip until that embargo lifts. My husband was all for it. As soon as he heard, he's like, "You have to do this." I was like, "Well, I kind of already am." But yeah, he was actually so excited. I mean, it's just such an extraordinary opportunity. I mean, of course, he was nervous too, but I think also that the White House is taking every possible precaution. And this was, we were given such short notice, but the trip itself had been in the works for months. I mean, they've been planning this for months, and very few people in the administration knew about it. But the White House, the National Security Council, the Pentagon, the State Department, like across all these departments and agencies, this planning has been unfolding in the background, even if involving very few people, to make sure that every piece of this trip goes smoothly. So, really, we just got to work planning for it. And funny enough, like a lot of the planning really just entailed, okay, what does this trip look like as a new mom? And, do we have to go get a different pump? And, I won't have my phone. So, we won't really be in touch, but that also means I won't have like materials when I'm trying to write. And like I print. I was like, told my husband, I was like, "Can you go to CVS and like print all these articles about Ukraine? Like I cover it, but you don't have it all by memory, right?"
Right.
We're in a generation where, of course, you Google while you're writing.
Right.
So it's like there's all
You
these
Google your
things.
old stories even. You're like, "I don't remember what I
Yeah,
wrote like
you
3 weeks
take
ago."
what we call beam header from your old stories. Like you take like chunks of previous stories, so just so you have some context you can throw in real quick. And it's like, oh, I need a tape recorder because I actually record with my phone. I use the voice memos app on my phone to record everything. I don't use a tape recorder. I don't even use a pen and pad. I type in my notes app on my phone. Now this is obviously, I'm showing like how maybe just how much things have changed in terms of like how you report. But I don't remember last time I stood with a pen and pad. I just don't do it. It's much faster if I'm typing on my phone. So all this stuff, I was like, okay, I won't have access to the tools that I typically use to report. And I have to be able to record every detail here because people don't have access. No one else has access to this trip. They're all going to be relying on my summary. And the other journalist who's with me is a photojournalist. So he'll be providing the visuals. But in terms of like, who's there, what people are wearing, the sights, the sounds, what the president says, what Ukrainian President Zelensky says, where we are, all the context, that's all going to be falling on my shoulders. So there's
That
just
is
You couldn't use your phone when you were there either. That is what you're saying. Even
no.
once you were there.
No, so we didn't have our phone. We had our so they let us keep our laptops without, accessing Wi-Fi. But the problem is when you're running around, it's not like you can like have your laptop in your hand and like typing. You're just sort of that's just there for on the train ride if you wanted to kind of like take notes. But there's not on the train ride itself, there was not much note taking to do other than recording like, okay, we left at this time and we landed at this time. So really it was just it was just the voice recorder that I had and the pen and pad. And then when we were in Kyiv, so we get to Kyiv, we get to the train station, and President Biden goes to Mariinsky Palace. That's like the ceremonial home of the Ukrainian president, sorry. And President Zelensky has not really been living there since the war. But he was, they met at the palace, and then they walked around this cathedral that's been very symbolic for Ukrainian soldiers. Obviously, there's been conflict since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. So there were a bunch of like symbolic places that they toured. And then we went to the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, and the president went inside. And during this time, we're in a van. We're just kind of waiting outside the embassy. that's when, the people who were escorting us on the ground came by and said, okay, the embargo has lifted because photos had surfaced on social media of President Biden and President Zelensky walking around the streets of Kyiv. And
Right.
so
And the White House didn't think that would happen. I mean, they didn't
Did
expect
that
that.
come from Ukraine? Somebody in Ukraine
Well,
did that, right? It
yeah,
had to be,
there were
right?
videos.
yeah. I mean,
of-
they anticipated it would happen. I think they were like, in some ideal world, because they had cleared a lot of the streets. So it's basically like Zelensky's people and Biden's people. So it's kind of like there's not really, but even if they cleared the streets, there were a couple things that were happening. One is that people from their apartment buildings could
Yeah.
see the like
the
motorcade.
limos, the motorcade. I
Yeah, they
think
see the
that's what happened
motorcade, they see the
first.
activity. And then, everyone was wondering if President Biden would go to Ukraine. So there's people from their apartment buildings who are taking video and putting it on Twitter. And then just probably some people in Zelensky's circle as well, because it seemed to go out on his feed on Twitter before it was clear that we were supposed to talk about it, which is fine. I mean, I think they anticipated this would happen. And so that we finally saw our phones again, pretty much like, I don't know, it had been almost 36 hours or something. So, and then it was like, okay, go, you can start sending your reports. You can start sharing.
Okay. Once the world sort of knew about it.
Once the world knew, although we
Did you
still
get-
weren't allowed to talk about the train. They said, you cannot talk about how we got here until we've left. He needs to be off the train.
right.
And then you can confirm that he took a train, because this train still has to get out of Ukraine. And now that the word is out, yes, we've secured, obviously, kind of secured the area, but there's still a 10-hour train ride back to Poland. And they gave a couple hours heads up to the Russians. And obviously it's like, basically, don't you dare, right? But I mean, still a 10-hour train ride. Anything can happen. And
Well, it must have made it that the train ride back must have been way scarier than the train ride there, because then you're like, people
Everyone.
might assume, or it was easier to figure out, right?
But they
it's one of those things where I think we were kind of like, on the one hand, it's like you feel like a weight had been lifted because it's like out there. On the other hand, you are kind of like, hopefully no one tries something. I mean, they had US fighter jets circling the border of Ukraine and Poland just in case.
Okay.
So, but the fact they had them circling just in case was like, we're ready. We're ready.
Was there anything top secret that you could share with us now that, I mean, besides the trip itself and everything else, like, did they have Black Hawk, what are they called? Black Hawk helicopter?
Black Hawk Down. I don't know.
Yeah.
Black
Did they have something there that, you could tell us about that?
I mean, they had like, they just had a lot of security, and it included a lot of armed forces. And I can't honestly even say just offhand who a lot of them were. And, we were told not to identify them because they were assets and it was risky that, to talk about where they are. But I think it was certainly like a lot of people that you just don't normally see. It's not like Secret Service alone. And it's not just like, okay, these are troops. You're like, okay, these are highly trained professionals.
Oh,
I don't
you
know.
had like Navy SEALs and
And you, excuse me. And at some point, we also picked up Ukrainian military as well on the way in on the train. There were a few stops, and it seemed like they'd also picked up some security from the Ukrainian side.
There were stops. They stopped, and they didn't have regular passengers on.
No regular passengers. They stopped clearly to pick up security and to go through some security checks.
Did they have anybody following, like in a
That's
I
what
don't
I'm
know
asking.
how fast the trains go in Ukraine, but do they go 100 miles an hour or 40 miles an hour? Did they have cars and stuff like following the train in case they needed
They
to
had
get
to have
people?
something.
They must have had something we couldn't see and didn't know.
Yeah.
Like I said, the jets were at the border, but I mean, of course, I'm sure they have ways of tracking, and they probably had people at different points.
Oh yeah. They had so much satellite imagery going on, and probably every like nanosecond there's like a whole team.
I want to go. So I want to go back to the start of this a little bit. Okay, so you get the word, you talk it over with your husband. How do you tell you're like, hey, surprise? Guess what? Thought I was going to Poland. I mean, break it down for us, that conversation, if you don't mind sharing a little bit.
When they said surprise, he's going.
Yeah.
No, when you told your husband, hey, surprise, guess what? You thought I was going to Poland. Now I'm going to Kyiv.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, well, it's so funny. So there's a lot that had kind of happened. And one thing that was funny is first when the White House told us, one thing that we were sort of wondering, and so when I told my husband is it definitely going to happen? Right? Because they told us Friday afternoon, and we weren't supposed to meet at Andrews Air Force Base until 2 a.m. on Saturday night, Sunday morning. So there's a long window where the whole thing can get called off. And so you're kind of like preparing for it. There's like an adrenaline rush. And I think my husband had the same adrenaline rush, but we're like, this could all just disappear an hour from now because something maybe was compromised or they decide not to do it. And I think one thing that was also funny is they told us to look out for an email. They said, you're going to get this email on Saturday and it's going to say arrival instructions for the golf tourney. And that's going to be your instructions for reporting to Andrews. Because obviously,
a golf
Do
tournament?
you golf, by the way?
I don't. Andrews Air Force Base has a golf course.
Yeah.
But I don't golf. But yeah, I get, they're protecting search terms and all this stuff as well. And so, that's why my husband is actually a contractor at the State Department. He works for a third-party company. So he's a foreign policy nerd anyway. So I think he was just immediately like, oh my gosh, this is amazing.
Cool.
We got to do it. This is great. But, I obviously, there's just a lot of, well, it's funny. There's two conversations that are happening. And one is just how extraordinary this is, how risky it might be, what's it going to entail for me in terms of safety, what are the precautions, what's it going to look like? Like, it's a long trip. It was going to be basically almost 48 hours. And like we said, 20 from start to finish, and 20 of those hours are spent on a train. How do we deal with all the logistics of not having my phone and just having to do my job without the, like I said, tools that I typically use? And then there's this parallel conversation just about the fact that, we have a baby and, it's like I'm pumping, and then there's childcare. I mean, the whole thing that had been nice about the plan to leave for Poland on the night of Monday, February 20th, was that, we were going to have the weekend together, and, that Monday was President's Day. So daycare was closed. So it's like, okay, I'm not, he's not going to have to solo parent for, too long. And without the, it's like, suddenly it's like, oh, you're actually gonna be on your own for like the rest of the weekend, in addition to the days that I'm in Poland. And yeah, we got to figure out, we're just gonna have to, and also like, what do we tell family? Because the other thing is you're only allowed to tell one person, one editor and then your spouse. And just falling off the grid.
You
like
kind of have to lie to your family.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to my parents every day. I talk to my husband's parents especially when you have a baby, because everyone's FaceTiming you. Like, everyone wants to see her every day. It's like, this, even if it's for a couple minutes, you're texting, you're in touch with, my sister-in-law actually was going to have a baby on the day that I was going to be in Ukraine. So that, if I was just completely MIA, it would raise a lot of suspicion, right? There's this like, that, no text, nothing like to say congratulations or to check in. So basically I told the people who I'm in touch with on a daily basis, like my immediate family and my in-laws, like the people I talk to every day who would be wondering where I am or concerned, I essentially said like, oh, well, I have to actually do this hostile environment training before Poland. Even though Poland is a NATO country and it's safe, it's right at the border, it's the anniversary of the war. I came up with what was plausible enough. They're just preparing for all contingencies. You never know. And I've got to go to hostile environment training, and they're, they do take your phones at those as well. So I'm just going to be out of pocket starting Saturday night. So
or you could have given your phone to like the White House correspondence person, just say, hey, if my sister-in-law has a baby, just like, this is what I was saying.
Yeah, exactly. Can you just like
for me?
Can you automate a text for me? Like, yeah,
that's funny. Well, that was good. That was a good story.
Yeah,
but it must feel bad that you're like, I have to lie to my family.
And you wrote,
they'll forgive you.
You wrote in your reporter's notebook, is that was the column?
Yep.
Yeah, that you couldn't even use your own pumping equipment. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah. So there was a huge question around what equipment can I use? So I have a pump that you plug in, and it's like, you know, it has to be plugged in order to be used. And my thing was, are there outlets on the train? And then they were like, the White House was like, yes, but we wouldn't rely on them because we don't know if the outlets will work. I mean, sometimes you're on Amtrak and the outlet's not working. I mean, we can't just assume. And it's too long of a stretch to get away with, you know, not pumping. I was, at this point I was 10 months postpartum. So also just the way that works is like, you have to be very regular to maintain. You're kind of already like dealing with like a decrease, and it's a tough time, for a lot of moms, in their like breastfeeding journey. So then they say, but a lot of the wireless pumps that they're like wearable, that so you don't have to plug them in. You can charge them ahead of time. A lot of them have Bluetooth because that they use it to track, you can track on an app. Like, we live in a world of technology where, we've created all these high tech, even pumps. So they were like, the White House was like, well, you can't use it if it has Bluetooth. So because that's what I said, can I bring a wireless one? And they're like, well, does it have Bluetooth? A lot of them do. So it's a whole back and forth where Kate Bedingfield, the communications director at the White House, was like, just send me the model and I'll get it. I'll make sure it's okay. Okay. And at some point she emailed me and be like, all set on the pump. I basically did go buy another one that you could charge ahead of time, but it didn't, I had to go to the.
You're like, I need to find one with like AA batteries.
Yeah, I was explaining to her, I was like, it can't have Bluetooth. It needs to have a good battery life. And she was just like, okay. I was like, it's complicated. I'm just going on a trip and I'm not gonna have, I just said, I'm not gonna have access to Wi-Fi. I won't have access to outlets. She was like, okay. But it's just funny because one thing that I thought was amusing about this is I'm just like picturing these conversations that are happening around the logistics of the trip. And someone has to be like, well, the reporter who's coming with us actually is pumping and clearing like my pump with Secret Service. Like there's so many logistics to sort out.
National security is now involved in your breast
my
pumping journey.
Yeah, like that's now part of the conversation. But I do think that was again a testament to like working moms being in the room. Like I just think like it's people just get it. Even when I was telling them like it's not an option to not pump. Like you have to understand where I am in this particular stage of being postpartum. They're like, hey, look, we've been there. We know. We'll
you just can't turn that off for 3 days and then turn it back on. That's not how the body works.
Yeah, like
and Thomas never had to deal with this. Is that what
yeah? And another thing I wrote about was like because I had my phone. I mean, one thing that a lot of women do when they're pumping to try and get more milk, because it's like kind of a hormonal response, is you look at pictures and videos of your kid. That's just like, I mean, it doesn't, you don't have to. A lot of people do it. You're nodding your head. It's like it's just a common thing because it triggers our hormonal response. Sometimes you get more milk that way. So I would often just sit there while I would be pumping and watch videos of Sophia and on my phone and look at pictures of her. And I'm like, I won't be able to do that. So then I sent my husband to CVS to print some of my
print up some pictures
of her. I was like,
any woman also knows that. Like if you're breastfeeding and you're at a restaurant and a baby's crying, you're like, oh no, it's a problem.
It's like things happen. You feel things. And it's so important for me to actually write. I'm glad you brought up the notebook to write about that, because I also think it was important. It just worked out this way where I was a reporter covering this trip at this particular stage in my life. But this trip ended up having like a whole other set of legs, where there was the trip itself, a historic wartime visit, something that had never really been done before. And when I was there, that was the focus. I'm there. I'm not the story. I'm just there to write the pool reports. I wrote our news story. I wrote like kind of a color story on how the trip came together. And that was it. I was not planning to write anything about myself. I actually just tweeted when we got to Warsaw, I just jokingly tweeted a photo of like the bags where I had collected all my breast milk. And I made a joke about how, I didn't manage to get any souvenirs for Sophia from Kyiv, but I got her the only thing she cares about the most. And it's just like the tweet kind of went viral, and the amount of response I got from other working parents, but especially working moms and just moms, they didn't have to working moms, stay-at-home moms. It's just it triggers so many people. And the response was so overwhelming. And I realized I had hit a nerve, and I was like, huh. And then when in Warsaw, once all the other reporters who were going to cover that trip had gathered, they're like, you got to write about this. It's just such an important piece of the story. So then a couple weeks after, we ran that reporter's notebook as a personal reflection, so that the trip stood for itself. And I didn't, want to center myself in that story. And then a couple weeks later, it was an opportunity to open up a conversation around breastfeeding and pumping and the stigma around it, kind of like taking the stigma away. It's something that so many of us have to do, and it's just part of being a working mom. About childcare, about going back to work after maternity leave, and a lot of the feelings that you go through. Like I said, the importance of other working moms being in the room, but also just having the tools, the resources you need to succeed. What a difference that made. It was really, really important for me to open up that conversation, and to be able to, either trigger a debate or have something that resonates with a lot of people, but also gave, hopefully other employers the opportunity to take a look and say, oh, we could probably do better.
Yeah. Well, that's the power of journalism too, is telling, obviously you tell stories every day that create massive impact, but the power of telling your own story, and journalists hate to be the center of their own story. It's like it goes against everything they want to do. But if you didn't tell that story, I mean, I think about somebody else working and coming back, and a boss says, I don't know if we can do the whole pumping thing. Like, how can we accommodate that? Well, if someone can go to Kyiv and pump for, I mean, can you imagine, like, if you can't pump in an office or as whatever situation, you just prove that it's possible anywhere. There should be no excuses for that being a barrier for women if they want to do the work that they want to do and also pump as well. I mean, some may choose not to, which is totally fine too. But anything can be done, right?
Yeah, it's like anything can be done because that's the thing. No, it's like, to your point, there's no excuses when you see something like this.
Yeah.
And one thing that really resonated with me, and why I actually was motivated to write the story, the essay, was when I had tweeted that photo from Warsaw. This other veteran journalist had shared it, the tweet, and said, this is just such a change from when women like myself had to hide in closets and bathrooms and pump and not even tell our bosses that we had a baby or that we were breastfeeding and pumping. Otherwise, we'd risk losing out on assignments.
Yeah.
And that really struck a chord, because, I'm thinking about all the women who came before me who did have to just, who didn't have a space to pump, but also couldn't really share that because it was seen as a liability. And for me, I think one thing that I said in the story is, being a parent, but especially being a mom, just because of there's still a lot more burden that is put on moms in our society even today. It just brings out this strength in you, a whole different level of strength you didn't know you had. And so I actually felt like, I'm better at my job now that I'm a mom. Like I know how to multitask in a whole different way than I did before. And I have had to summon the stamina to pump 4 times a day while also nursing 2 or 3 times a day, while, dropping my kid off to daycare, doing all the stuff you have to do at home in addition to your day job. So if anything, it showed just how much stronger you actually are and what you're actually capable of. And that's why that piece was so important to me.
Yeah. And I agree wholeheartely. I think becoming a mom makes you realize, well, because you have to be, but you're like, wow, I'm like a superhero, because you have to be for this little child. So you're like, you become stronger. I think for most women, becoming a mother makes you stronger because you just you have to be. But let's get to some of your other, like,
wait a minute. I just want to find out what else she did. I mean, you got 2 10-hour plane rides and you don't have your devices, and I mean, did you like read?
You went old school.
Did you read an old school book? I mean,
it's so funny. I brought
10 hours besides.
Got the most sleep she's had since her Sophia was.
Yeah, everyone was like, enjoy the sleep. I brought 2 books with me and didn't open them at all, which I was like, oh, I'll finally read, and I didn't read. On the way it was exhausting because it got to Andrews at 2 a.m. We didn't take off till like 4:30 in the morning, basically, or awake the whole time. And that flight, first to Ramstein, Germany to refuel, and then from there to this place called Rzeszów, Poland. It's in eastern Poland. We have like 2 flights, one of which is like maybe 7 hours, the other one is a couple hours more. That's like, this is really the only opportunity you have to sleep at first. So, some of it was just trying to sleep, knowing I might not. Then the train ride, you would think that on this 10-hour train ride, most of which is happening overnight, that we would have slept more. But that's when there was just so much adrenaline, because it's literally like pitch black and everything's still happening in secrecy, and there's so many nerves, there's so much adrenaline. And that's when I started thinking, like, okay, I better start putting together very meticulous notes and also pre-writing a pretty good story, because I do know what is about to unfold, some of it. And as soon as this embargo lifts, it's going to be go, go, go. And, I imagine telling your editors that you were one of two journalists who knew this trip was going to happen, and you had not prepared like a pretty good, thorough story that was ready to go as soon as you could send it out. And so I was kind of putting together notes, and then pumping every 3 hours too. So there's also that. Like I was trying to like balance, like, okay, I slept on the plane, so now I'll pump on the train. So I only slept the last 2 hours of that train ride. And then on the way back, then it was all just writing and reporting, because on the way back, it's known to the world. So I'm sorry to Prince Harry. I did not open my copy of Spare. That's there. It was like, I also brought reading that would be like totally,
Mindless or
yeah, like
just like
it's not, it's funny, it's not actually lighthearted at all. It's like very serious about mental health and his time in Afghanistan, but it's not, it's just something for me. It's like, it's almost like fiction for us, right? So yes, it was, I brought stuff that would not have anything to do with my job, or in theory not be stressful, but I didn't even get a chance to do anything other than think about the trip and pump.
how many stories
Wow.
did you have to file?
I wrote 2 stories. One was a news story, and then one was like a color story, just kind of about how the trip came together and some more scenes from the ground. But then I also had to write these pool reports, and those I wanted to be as thorough as possible, because those were going to go out to everyone who subscribes to the White House press distribution list, but also just who they're going to be shared widely, not just in the US, but around the world. So I was kind of focusing on all that writing. And then, we had once he was in Kyiv, like many other places, we had a live blog going. So then you're just like sending things like, here, just take this, here's a chunk, and then you're just also, we were still negotiating also the terms of what we could share and when we could share it. So the agreement was that we can't share anything about the president's location until 15 minutes after he's left, wherever he is. And so with the train, I was like, this is tricky now, because we're on the train again for 10 hours. And people are wondering. I said we've left Kyiv, and I'm just 10 for 10 hours. No one knows where we are. And the White House was like, sorry. And I think the New York Times had a line in there about how he did take a train. They had found it out through their own reporting, and I was like, can I say it now? And the White House was like, sorry, like if other reporters get it through their sources, that's fine, but we are not saying that he is on a train. I was like, okay. So I think so a lot of it was just spent, writing stories, writing pool reports, and going back and forth with White House officials on what we can share and when we can share it.
A lot was made. I don't know if a lot was made, but some was made by some in the media about the sirens that went off when they took the walk around outside. What was there an air raid, or was it what was the sirens? What were the sirens?
It's hard to say. We heard these air raid sirens when President Biden and President Zelensky were walking outside of St. Michael's Cathedral, the cathedral I mentioned in Kyiv. And I was like, what is that? And there was a local journalist, because we were joined by some local reporters on the ground once we were in Kyiv. And the local reporter was like, oh, those go off all the time. And I was like, is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. It's as much a reminder as any that you're in a war zone, and this is you're the capital city of a country that's at war. So some were like, oh, is it just like a bit of drama? Like, are they just doing it to, make it seem like it's, this
super dangerous?
Yeah, or are they doing it to like discourage people from coming into airspace? I mean, our understanding was that like a MiG had entered airspace, but we don't know. I mean, it's one of those things that no one really knows. But I don't think there was I will say there was not a real threat in the moment. that, there was a risk throughout the trip, but there was not like an imminent threat at any point in time. And again, like it's like something that the fact that someone told me that that's a regular occurrence, it kind of just was, if anything, a window into what it's like when you're in a country that's at war, and this has actually just become normal and part of the day-to-day life for people over there.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about just covering the White House. What
Well, wait, one last question. Can I ask one last question about the
little time
I know.
there, and
So when you got back and everybody found out the truth, what was the response? What was the reaction? And then I'll shut up. And
No, it's fine. It's funny. I did have to sort of say, well, when I finally got my phone back, I texted some of those people, like my close family and friends who I told I'd be offline. I was like, oh, so word's out, I'm actually in Ukraine. I was like, don't worry, I'm safe. We'll talk soon. And of course, everyone was, at this point, everyone's then following the coverage. And then people are, of course, starting to see that, like, okay, there's only 2 journalists there. And of course, because there are only 2 of us, our names are also out there. So I think people were very excited. I mean, when and plus I was back when, then we ended up in Warsaw. And there was just a lot of support and encouragement from colleagues in the media about, the trip itself, the willingness to do the trip, reporting on the trip. And I think it was like very humbling just to kind of know that everyone really benefited from the coverage, given how nerve-wracking it was to be responsible for so much of it. But, then of course it was just, it's one of those things where now you're just the reporter who went to Ukraine with the president, right? Like you're like, this is sort of like which I don't mind. I mean, it's cool. It's fine.
right. This
cool.
guy's over here. He's like, yeah, I just want to talk about the trip. And I'm like, there's so much other things.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it is something though, right? Like it's never not going to be something that is a conversation starter, to say the least. And I think though, for me, like I will say one more, because it kind of marries the 2 conversations we were having. I get back, and I think a lot of people were very much focused on the fact that I had just gotten back from maternity leave and that I was pumping. So I think it was just more validation that that's a conversation we need to have in tandem with the trip itself. Because I was struck by how many people, in terms of like when they found out it was me, were like, it was you, you have,
Wait, didn't you just have a child?
yeah, you have a baby at home. So that I think was what was really striking about the reaction from people, was that it was like impossible for them to separate the fact that I was doing this trip from the fact that I was doing it as a new mom.
all right.
That's amazing.
So,
But tell us a little bit about just White House reporting itself.
Yeah.
How long have you been doing it? And what would you say? Obviously, there's a lawsuit right now going on with the Fox News. And how is all that stuff factoring in? Do you just block it out and be like, listen, I just got to do my job and tell my stories and do what I do? Or does that stuff kind of like invade, or do you guys have to do extra? How does that change, or you're just like, it's just noise and you just do what you do when you cover the White House? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, to the latter point, it's just noise and we do what we do. We go about our day-to-day jobs as journalists. We don't pay attention to what's happening externally, whether it's with respect to lawsuits or even just, debates and of media coverage, around media coverage, and anything that might be like a side story about any one news organization or the media writ large. It's just not relevant to our jobs. For us, it's like we're there to report. We're there to ensure that the public is informed. I first covered the White House under President Obama a couple years out of college. So, I've been doing this for a decade, and this is my 3rd presidency that I'm covering. This is the first time I'm sort of like one of the White House correspondents versus I did cover the Trump administration as a White House correspondent at The Guardian, my former employer, but I was, because The Guardian is based in the UK, and although I worked for the US edition, we weren't there every day in the briefing room. So this is the first time I'm doing the full scale. I'm in the briefing room, traveling with the president and all of that. But, I first started doing this under Obama. And I think what you realize when you cover the White House is every little thing matters. It's just, this is the highest office in the land. As the leader of the free world, people want to know everything. And it's also your job to, in the name of transparency, to report or at least, present as much information as possible. And you also have to very quickly become an expert on any issue under the sun, right? Because I covered the Biden administration's response to the war in Ukraine in the initial month or so before I left up for maternity leave. Then I went on maternity leave, and I came back, and I wasn't covering 1 year later where things stood. I was so you're covering any number of issues on any given day, and so you have to really quickly bring yourself up to speed. I covered a lot of the Biden administration's COVID response in the first year and a half, since that was what dominated this first year plus in office. But then the next day, and one day I'm writing about COVID. I know a lot about that because that's what that's this issue I'm focusing on within the White House at the time. But then the next day, maybe there's some kind of conflict or escalating tensions with China. And suddenly you have to switch gears and be like, all right, I got to really write this story, and I have to do it quickly. And I can't be like, well, what's going on with China? You just have to kind of keep tabs on all these little things. It's like, now he's negotiating with the Republicans in Congress on the debt ceiling. So now you have to write about the debt ceiling. Now, tomorrow, there's maybe, another issue that they might be revisiting the gun control debate, and then it's doing a healthcare announcement, and it's just one thing after the other. And so it's actually like a very all-encompassing, exhaustive place to report. And I think, to bring it full circle, you really do realize the weight of reporting on the White House because of how much what comes out of the highest office in the land matters and how much it affects the public.
Right. And you have to, whatever the White House is an expert on, but they have like a whole set of experts to help them, right? If they're dealing with supply chain issues and wherever, name the country, then, but you like have yourself, and you're like, oh, now I need to be the expert on a supply chain with the barges coming in or whatever. I've never thought about barges before, other than looking at them on a river or something, right? That's
we luckily at the Wall Street Journal, we have a lot of policy reporters, but and so you can lean on your colleagues and say, hey, look, like who's an expert in this space. But of course, to your point, it's like, yes, you do that when you can, but it's not always going to be in any moment you can just draw on someone else immediately. You sometimes have to get that material from someone later and say, hey, can you actually explain this tax thing to me? A lot of times you are just doing the first take especially if it's breaking news. And that's where Google is great, like we said, because you can Google the journal's other coverage and say, okay, let's see what we've been saying about this in the last few days and weeks. But I think, but the advice I always have given to other journalists that's related to this, there's lots of advice I've given, but one thing I've always said is don't pretend that don't act like you know something. If you don't pretend. There's no winning in pretending you know something when you don't. And so it's better to just stick to what you know, stick to the facts, and you can fill in the rest later, because obviously this is a profession where mistakes will cost you tremendously, and it's really hard to rehabilitate your reputation if you've gotten things wrong. So you also have to remind yourself and ground yourself and say, look, I know this, I'm going to stick to this, and I'm going to get the who, what, when, why, where out there. And if there's one of those things that I have to fill in later, that's okay. And so, but you do become, I think you do become a quick study, all that being said.
So we got to let you go because we've taken up a lot of your time. So I got a real quick question. I know it's a quick answer. What's the difference between covering the Trump White House and the Biden White House? 30 seconds. There you go.
He's like, no, it's going to take an hour.
I know. Well, the quick version is it's a lot less busy, time intensive, and chaotic. It can be kind of boring sometimes. That's just the truth. I think a lot of people who watch and read the news tell us the same. You are not operating in the same level of a 24/7 news cycle. And the Biden administration is just a lot more orthodox. So, you know, people, it's not just like, okay, it mirrors the Obama administration because they're both Democratic administrations and they serve together as president, vice president. It also mirrors the Bush administration. You know, traditionally there's a way of doing things. You know, it's very calculated. You know, we're talking about this issue this week and we're going to announce this policy this week. We're going to hold a call with reporters or a briefing, and you know, we're going to unroll whatever this policy is, and it's all very straightforward. We'll take their questions, and we might not say a whole lot that's, you know, we might not give them a whole lot that's news, and it's just very kind of orthodox and conservative in its approach because you want to stay on message and you don't want to make news unexpectedly, or you know, you don't want to create distractions. Whereas with the Trump administration, on any given day, there were like 6 to 8 headlines because the president himself is tweeting or saying something just completely off the cuff, and it's triggering backlash, or it's just, you know, did he just start war with another country? Did he not? We don't know. And then there's, you know, and then even his aides as well. Like there was a lot of discord behind the scenes. There was a lot of drama.
A lot of leaks too, right? Like a lot of
leaks,
drama, like you said.
I mean, one example I could give you that just kind of crystallizes things for me about the Trump administration is there was one day when he welcomed the Russian foreign minister to the White House, and a big controversy out of that meeting was that President Trump had allegedly shared classified information with the Russian foreign minister as part during that visit. And, you know, as was often the case at the time, especially because Republicans controlled, you know, at that time, actually both chambers in Congress, because before the midterms. But, you know, there's a kind of this routine where reporters would go ask Republicans, like, what do you have to say about, you know, this is what allegedly happened, and what's your response? And they would kind of either they would criticize him, or they would pretend they didn't see it, or, you know, depended on who you're talking to. And so I had this whole story gathered, like Republicans react to, you know, allegations that Trump shared classified information with the Russian foreign minister, and it's ready to go. And I think it published in the evening. And then 5 minutes after it published, he fired Jim Comey. He fired the FBI director. And that story just became completely irrelevant. And now it's like, oh, you know, this is an even bigger story than what I just filed on. Now I've got to report on this. Everyone's saying it's like a Watergate moment, and it's going to open up this like huge, it may trigger this big investigation. Maybe this is like, who knows? Maybe this will lead to impeachment proceedings. It didn't at the time. It didn't. But, you know, even that story then at some point was overtaken by something else. And so it was just any given day, like what seemed like the biggest story in the country, let alone in Washington, was overtaken by something else out of the same White House. And you're just and you, when you look back on those 4 years, there are major moments that took place that are a footnote at best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually forgot they happened because so much happened.
So did you have all these stories that lots of times that just got thrown away, or did they just end up online and then you had to start over on the next one, or it just became smaller and then you're like, now I got to go to the Comey. Oh wait, now something else happened, so that buried the Comey story. Like, so how did that work?
Yeah, it was a mix of both. Sometimes that story just was online and it stayed online, but the attention was very temporary, momentary, and people moved on to the next one. Other times you were working on something and it just got scrapped because this is a much bigger deal and no one's going to care about that anymore. So, you know, now we're in a space where you've had moments that have from the White House that have triggered 24/7 coverage. I think the biggest example would be the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Right.
You know, the Omicron outbreak in December of 2021, when everyone had been vaccinated, and suddenly, like, you know, people are calling in sick to work and everything's being shut down again and all the restrictions are coming back. There's been these moments that have been kind of chaotic, and you know, it's been 24/7 coverage around the White House itself and its handling of something or its response to something. But you remember them because that's not to say there haven't been, you know, any number of missteps, but the big moments are actually pretty few and far between. And a lot of it's just the sort of a return to divided government, and there's a president who's now dealing with a House Republican majority, and most of his agenda is dead, and now he's gonna prepare for re-election. So we all think, what's that gonna look like? Gonna be a crowded field on the other side. It's just kind of snapped back into a much more
Normal.
familiar rhythm. Yeah, well, a much more familiar rhythm, like we're in a very polarized environment. And everyone always says it. It sounds like a cliche, but it just remains true. But I think, yeah, even if it just seems like more and more has shifted in terms of the rhetoric and the I think that the height of we're in a much more heightened moment when it comes to partisan politics and like real political tensions, to the point where there's a real threat of political violence here in this country. I think it's still, despite all that, you're still dealing with a White House that's operating in a pretty orthodox way.
Are you still, though, as a White House reporter, are you basically on call 24/7? I mean, do you ever get to feel like, oh, I've got the weekend, or you kind of just always feel like you're working on some level?
You are kind of always plugged in, but we have a team of 6 reporters on our White House team at the Wall Street Journal. So I'm very lucky in this job that we've got a great team, and there is work-life balance, because it's not just on you. Whereas there have been other jobs, depending on if you work in a smaller bureau where it's just a handful of you or only you, and you have to cover a lot more ground. But you kind of still always have to be a little bit plugged in for the reasons I said, because tomorrow it could be you, and you could be the one who has to write the story and write it quickly. And you don't really have the option to just be like, I don't know what that is. Right? Like you still have to figure it out. You have to have a little bit of context with you at all times. But you are kind of always on call. I mean, when since we were talking about the previous administration, I mean, I remember getting a call at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was asleep, and it was like, oh, so not sure if you saw the news, but President Trump has COVID. And I was like, what? And I'm just like sleeping. And it's like, anyway, it's like you have these moments where it's like, I was getting this call from a producer because I was supposed to do a panel, a TV panel the next morning. I mean, you're like, are you going to be ready to go at whatever at 8 a.m.? And it's like, you just have to keep going. You just have, you get up, you do your job, and you figure it out.
So so basically your job has really prepared you for motherhood. the little infants also have you on call 24/7.
Every time she's sleeping well, something goes on, and she's actually a really good sleeper. I feel like I want to be careful, because I'm like, making her seem like we actually, all things considered, and according to all our friends too, we've got like we're very lucky. I'm jinxing it, but she's an easy kid. She actually generally is a good sleeper too. So we're very lucky. But it is one of those things where just when you've hit a rhythm and you're like, okay, it's all going well.
I think for us, it was the day our young son, we were in a townhouse, and we hadn't childproofed yet.
Which we were like, you got to do the
behind.
gates. You got to do the gates. We got to do the gate. We had the gates. We just didn't put them up.
Kathy was in one room and I was in another room, and she yells, "Do you have them?" And I'm like, "I thought you had them." And then we
heard bump, 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 and we were like,
"Oh boy!"
Now we got a childproof. Reminder. Today we're childproof.
We need to childproof.
Childproofing happens today.
We just moved our coffee table yesterday because Sophia is starting to try and like pull to stand, and just kind of like starting to sort of crawl, and we're like, oh boy, it's gonna happen, to your point, before we realize. And then we may end up, she may take a tumble or something, because like, oh, we kept talking about we should have childproofed and we didn't. So there's all these little things that are constantly keeping you on your toes, but it's also just the very best, as you guys know.
Yes, it's amazing. But yeah, do childproof. Learn from our mistake. That noise, he was fine. He had a small problem. But the noise, we were like, oh, we felt terrible, like terrible parents.
I mean, it's happened to people I know who have the gate too, because it's not, you don't always remember to close it. Like,
that's true.
He's 23 now and he still falls down steps. It doesn't matter. So wait, when's the book? When's the movie?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah, there
gosh.
has to be something, right? Like, come on, that's the thing.
Well, I think, it's funny. It's like, I hope that there's something I can put together at some point. That I really hope if I do put something together, it's something that does marry the trip with the motherhood piece of it. And maybe it's something that, Sophia can have one day to show her what's possible and what she's capable of as well one day.
All right. Well, when you're thinking about it, we will help do your press for you. 'Cause that's the other thing we do is a little PR. So you definitely have a great story in there. And wow, it definitely, at least it's a Netflix. Come on. It's a story. Who would
Pitch
play,
it. We should pitch
who
it.
would you want to play you?
I have no idea, actually. That's a great question. But
All right, let her go. Let her
Yeah.
go.
All right.
yeah.
Well, there you go.
You guys sound like you've got a pitch ready, so
I know. I'm even
Take
thinking
it.
of the actresses. Like,
yeah.
yeah. We got. Oh, I know. We can do Ashton Kutcher's wife. What's
Mila Kunis.
Yes, and she's from Ukraine.
She's Ukrainian.
I know.
Yeah.
And she's so cute. And you're
She's
adorable.
very generous.
There you go.
Yeah.
And she would be she plays a lot of mom roles too. So anyway, there we go. We got something going on.
Got it all set.
What's the Jonah Brothers' wife?
Priyanka Chopra.
Yeah. She's in a crazy. Well, and she does a lot of like crazy stunt movies and stuff.
Yeah,
A lot of her own stunts there.
All those sound amazing.
That could have been your training that you really didn't go to.
Exactly.
She could like demonstrate it.
All right.
Yeah.
For your articles in the Wall Street Journal from the White House.
Yeah, and how else do people follow you on Twitter? What's your Twitter?
Twitter at Sabrina Siddiqui. Same goes for Instagram. Those are pretty much the two platforms I use outside of my work at the Wall Street Journal.
Okay. All right.
Siddiqui, thank you so much. It was very.
Thank you. This was so much
fun. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have a good one.
Wow. That was amazing. She's like Superwoman. She's like Wonder Woman, super whatever. I don't know. Captain America, but the female.
I mean, can you imagine that? I mean,
no.
How many different levels that hit on? I mean,
I would have been scared to death to take the trip. Second of all, I would have been scared to death to be the one person responsible to get all the information out. And third of all, I would have been scared to death to be pumping and doing all that stuff. That was amazing. She's amazing.
You left out the war zone stuff.
Well, I said scared to death to take the trip to begin with.
It's wow.
She needs a Pulitzer Prize, right? She needs something. We're going to grant her. We just decided.
And I think this podcast deserves a Pulitzer Prize as well.
Yeah,
so
there you go. Anyway, so but not only did she do a great thing for journalism, I think what she did for women and showing that women should not be held back.
I think women who've been covering the White House for a long time, I can't speak for them, but I mean, think of all the women who have Judy Woodruff and
there have been a
Leslie Stahl
who are breaking ground before us, but she just broke ground for a lot of other women who are coming next.
And she broke ground level. Yeah.
For women in every industry. And that's amazing. Amazing.
Okay, we're amazing. Let's wrap it up.
Okay. Well, it was, we hope you enjoyed this week's episode. And After Deadline, the media podcast, is a production of On the Mark Media. If you enjoyed this particular podcast and want to hear more of our interviews with incredible journalists from around the world, you can follow us on social media at On the Mark Media and subscribe to After Deadline, the media podcast, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Until next time, we'll catch up with you after Deadline.